My name's Beth Strommen. I'm the director of Baltimore's Office of Sustainability, and it is my pleasure today to moderate a panel to talk all about land trusts. It's land trusts, a winning solution for land security. By the time you leave today, you will know what a land trust is. This is our goal. You can tell us whether we succeed or not. You'll know what a land trust is, how you might be able to use it if it's right for you, different models, different methods of developing land trusts and their function, and then probably most importantly, and this is a legal conference, what are those pesky legal issues associated with developing and implementing a land trust. We have a really awesome panel today. We have Nate Ella from the Department of Sociology, University of Wisconsin. Ms. Miriam Avins is Executive Director of our Baltimore Green Space, and Kelly Pfeifer from the Community Law Center, all who have a lot of experience with land trusts. I'll be providing more info on their backgrounds prior to the presentations, and what we thought we'd do, in order to develop a best use of time, if you will, we're asking people to hold your questions until the very end. So even though we have a 20-minute presentation for each one of them, I think in order to get the whole panel, I'll be asking all three of them to come stand up here at the end. That way, whatever your question is, you might get a different perspective from each person. Then finally, to help us on the panel adjust presentations, tweak them a little bit so that they provide you with the best information, I'm going to do an impromptu audience survey about who's in here and what your interest is. It's just a raise your hand thing, not long-winded. How many people in here today have a legal background and are representing from that standpoint? So take note. That side of the room. You've divided yourselves. How many people here are farmers, consider themselves farmers or gardeners? Okay, we have about 3. Students who are just learning? Both? Okay. You can have 2 categories. Nonprofits. Oh, we got a lot of nonprofits. Okay. And then somebody who might consider themselves other. Okay, I'm not going to ask you what other is. We'll leave that a mystery. Okay, and then how many people here are offended that I'm trying to put you into categories? I knew it. All right. Without much further ado, we're going to start with our first presenter, Nate Ella. Nate, surprisingly not, is a lawyer candidate in sociology, is a lawyer and a Ph.D. candidate, at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. His ongoing dissertation research examines how efforts to increase access to land for urban farms and gardens has affected property rules and norms in Chicago between the 1890s and today. He also works with the State Innovation Exchange and the Mayor's Innovation Project, which develop and disseminate model progressive laws and policies for U.S. states and cities, which is pretty awesome. Thank you, Nate, and why don't you come on up and take my place.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and to Miriam and Kelly for helping organize the panel. Maybe I will take that clicker, because I don't see a... All right. So my research, as Beth said, is in Chicago, and it's really great to get out of there and to hear about what people are doing in other places. It also gives me a chance to start pulling together my thoughts about Chicago, so thanks for the opportunity to have some sort of half-baked ideas and present them to you, and for your patience with that. In doing the research that I've been doing over the past half year in Chicago, I've noticed a couple of trends also looking around the country which feel like they might fit together. The first trend is on the ground, as we sometimes say. It seems like in recent years people have been asking themselves, so if we want to maintain our garden on a certain piece of land, what's the best way of doing that? And if you've got your land, or if you've got your garden on private land, you need to ask, so can we trust the private property owner to not kick us off next year? And the answer to that is often not really. I mean, it depends on who you're working with and what the terms are. But if it's on private land, often the owner will want to do something else. What if it's on public land? Here the answer is often maybe. If you're on parkland, maybe you have some sense of security. But if you're on a city-owned vacant lot, as we know, sometimes cities really love to sell those to developers, and then you're off looking for another place to garden. More and more, it seems to me, there's a trend of people saying, what about a land trust? Is that a good way to hold land for a garden or an urban farm? And it seems like more and more people are saying, maybe let's try that. One way of seeing this is to look at how urban agricultural land trusts have spread over the past 20 or 25 years. And I tried to put this map together just for this presentation. I'm sure it's woefully inadequate and incomplete, and you hopefully know about other things that don't appear on the map, and I'd love to hear about them if you do. So it seems like, as far as I can tell, things got rolling with Urban Garden Land Trust around 1981, when the Southside Community Land Trust was founded in Providence in Rhode Island. From there, in 1982, you saw the founding of land trusts for gardens in New Haven and in Boston, 86 in Philadelphia. In 88, back in Massachusetts, there was a garden land trust founded in Worcester, and another one in well, actually, it was the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in 88 in Boston, which got involved with growing food in vacant lots in the early 90s and then did a community greenhouse project. In 91, another one was founded in Boston. And in 98, finally got out of the Northeast with the founding of the Avins Land Trust in Georgia. 96, Neighbor Space in Chicago, which I'll talk about in a little bit. In 99, maybe some of you are aware of it, maybe some of you lived through it, things blew up in New York City when Giuliani wanted to sell a bunch of city-owned lots that people were gardening on. Trust for Public Land, a national organization, got control of a lot of those lots and founded Urban Agricultural Land Trust in a few of the boroughs. Then in 2000, Milwaukee, Washington, D.C. got involved. 2001, we have Troy Gardens, which is a community land trust project based in Madison, land trust in Tacoma, Washington. 2002, Los Angeles. 2003, Neighbor Space of Baltimore County. 2007, Baltimore Green Space, which Miriam runs. 2009, around there, people in Portland started thinking about using a land trust in Oregon to hold land for gardens in Portland. I think around 2010, people were interested in Durham. Not clear whether that actually got off the ground. Same thing, 2011, people in Minneapolis were interested in using a land trust to hold gardens. Also not clear just from surfing the internet whether they succeeded. Last year, a community land trust in Albuquerque started holding land for gardens. And then it sounds like there's interest and possible interest in San Francisco, where there isn't yet a land trust for holding urban agriculture land, but they're aware that this might be a good use for a good way of holding gardens on private land in the future. And from Marisa, who's here, it sounds like people in Pittsburgh are talking about potentially getting something going in Pittsburgh. So this is all to say that a lot's been going on in the past 20 years or so. The idea is spreading. It seems to be continuing to spread. And at the same time, there's this other trend, which, if you forgive me, is sort of an academic trend. Over the past couple of decades, social scientists, law professors, other sorts of scholarly types and scholarly activist types have gotten really into the idea of the commons as a way of managing resources, an alternative to ownership of resources by private property owners or by the state. One of the most influential commons thinkers has been Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2011. And she and people who follow her line of thought see commons governance as especially well suited to managing common pool resources. And these are things sort of like fisheries, as an example, where you've got units like fish, which people can take out of the common pool, but it's really hard to keep people from drawing on that. And I think it's possible, to me at least, to think about vacant urban space as a potential resource like this, where at least at the scale of a city, it's really hard to keep people off of all of the vacant land in a city. It's very expensive to do that. But at the same time, people can access this space if they want to, and whether it's gardening or selling drugs or cell phones or whatever, use some of that space and in a way keep other people from using when they're using it. So, well, Ostrom and other people like her like to think of commons governance as an institution that sort of comes about when people just self-organize. Historians like Peter Limbaugh and other scholars have been thinking about commoning as a social process and a social practice. Something that's active, something that might come about from bottom-up activity. And thinking about commoning as a verb in this way leads to questions about how and why people work to treat and govern a particular resource as a commons. Some of you might be familiar with David Harvey, who's an urban geographer. He did a lot of his early work in Baltimore. He was at Hopkins. And recently, he and other people have been thinking about, so where might a commons be or commoning happen in cities? And we often think about cities as sort of neatly split between the public and the private. The public, you've got parks and you've got streets, you've things like that, city hall. Private, you've got houses, businesses, apartments, parking lots, you know. But in that sort of landscape, where might the commons be? Harvey and other people often point to community gardens as a site of the commons and commoning. So here he is, appearing on Democracy Now! As any good leftist public intellectual needs to do from time to time. He wrote in this his recent book called Rebel Cities, which I recommend if you're interested in sort of activist things in cities. He wrote about community gardens as a space where people from a particular social group relate to an environmental resource in a way that's collective and non-commodified. It's outside of the market. So you might sell some produce from your community garden, but that doesn't stop the garden itself from being the product of commoning. It's not a market space, as he sees it. But he doesn't really get into how this happens, how it comes about, which is a good thing for graduate students like me because it gives us something to think about. Harvey's not the only one who thinks about gardens as commoning. This is a recent report that came out largely by public health and urban planning people who think about commoning as sort of a way to create well-being. These are a couple scholarly articles by people at the Stockholm Resilience Center who think of commoning and community gardens as an instance of commons as an important part of the process of urban resilience. But I think it's worth asking whether all of this is just sort of wishful thinking on behalf of some activist academics, and how we might think about it differently if we paid attention to what's going on the ground with urban ag land trusts. So to get started with that, it helps, I think, to think about the urban agriculture land trust as a type of alternative or social property form. In the way that it's structured, an urban ag land trust seeks to encode social and ecological benefits and obligations into property rules. In that way, it's an alternative to what we might think of as traditional do-what-you-will property. So, I mean, ordinarily, a property owner can exclude people, can use the property in whatever way, limited by things like zoning law and nuisance law. But basically, if you own it, it's yours to use or not use and sit and speculate on as you see fit. An urban ag land trust, by contrast, aims to keep land affordable precisely so that people who don't own it can use it, can access it, and can participate in conservation and management of the land in a way that acknowledges the responsibility that landowners and land users have to the community and to the environment, to plants, to animals, to insects, maybe even to the land itself. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with land trusts, and probably the people over here, the lawyer people and some of the law student people, if they've gotten to estates and trusts yet or property, are familiar. The basic idea of a trust is property and gives the benefit that comes from that property to someone else. It doesn't have to be social or ecological. I pay my rent to a trust in Chicago because my landlord decided, his family decided to put it in trust, probably not because it's good for the tenants or good for the earth or anything big like that, but probably because it helps them avoid taxes or it makes it easier if somebody dies to transfer it to somebody else. But urban ag land trusts seem to often be a type of open space land trust. These are often nonprofits that are set up to protect non-human nature by keeping often humans off of the land, especially in suburban areas that are under threat of development or rural areas where you might not want a farm to be on a particular piece of wetland that has some nice endangered frogs or dragonflies or something. My aunt works for the Nature Conservancy, and she can speak at great length about these wonderful dragonflies in northern Wisconsin that they preserve. The Community Land Trust is a different sort of beast, and it's developed since the 1960s to get people onto the land into affordable housing. It's more of an urban model. And that model often involves separating the house that you own from the land underneath it, which is owned by the trust, and you have a lease to that land. They call that a ground lease on the land under the homes that are part of the land trust. It also has this particular governance model in which the board is split in three parts between residents who live on the land, their neighbors who live in the communities around it, and the sort of normal people you think as being on a board, other nonprofit people from the community leaders, and that sort of thing. So in urban ag, there's an area where it seems to me these two land trust cousins who haven't typically hung out much with each other because they've been doing very different things, though they've both been using trusts, are starting to get interested in a similar area. Open space land trusts have been getting interested in holding land for urban gardens because they seem to involve the community. And people in the open space community see it as important to get the community involved in using the land if they want to support conservation of land. Community land trusts have been getting more interested in gardens and farms so that people who live in the houses in the land trust have dirt and get their local food from, but also with the housing crisis and interest in alternative revenue sources for community land trusts outside of just housing, they've been thinking, for better or for worse, and realistically or not, about maybe urban farms are a new source of revenue for community land trusts. To give a quick sense of where at least one urban land trust has come from and where it might be going, I want to talk quickly about Neighbor Space, which is the Urban Garden Land Trust in Chicago. It was born in the 1990s when there was a planning process and report that came out of it that announced that Chicago was in this open space crisis. They looked around and compared open space per capita in Chicago to 20 other metros around the country and found out that Chicago ranked at the time 18th, which people completely freaked out. Chicago's the second city. It aspires to always be the first in whatever way it can, and to be 18th was like totally unacceptable. So they looked around and they saw that there was tons of vacant land. There were 55,000 vacant lots in the city. It was nearly 15% of the city's land area. 30% of those vacant lots were already owned by the city or by nonprofits. There were 17% of the lots that were behind on taxes, which meant maybe you could take them from the owners and use them for some other purpose. But there was this dilemma concerning ownership. It didn't seem like the city wanted to be involved with managing people gardening all this land. It's a lot of dealing with people at a level that maybe city bureaucrats weren't interested in dealing with. There's a lot of potential liability in ways that they weren't used to thinking about liability of people using city land. At the same time, they didn't want to just give it to private developers because then you're not going to have gardens there and open space necessarily. So they decided they needed a new entity. They wanted to have this land trust. They called it Neighbor Space. And it came out of this intergovernmental agreement between the city, the Park District, and the County Forest Preserve District. And if you look at the board of Neighbor Space, it's still divided in three between people from the Chicago Park District, from the city, and from the Forest Preserve. They dominate the board. It's a very government sort of heavy organization. The other people come from nonprofits, University of Chicago, the landscaper. But the funding initially came almost entirely from the three. Each party kicked in $100,000 a year. Still, now they do some private fundraising, but it's still pretty much publicly funded. Last I checked, Neighbor Space has 97 sites for gardens around the city. There's hundreds of, nobody really knows how many hundreds of gardens in Chicago. So, you know, it's some portion of those are now held in trust. There's this cluster on the west side of Chicago. There's current interest in doing more in the Englewood neighborhood on the south side, which is famous in Chicago and I think maybe a little bit nationally now thanks to This American Life and other people who've paid attention to sort of the problems that the neighborhood is facing in terms of crime, unemployment, vacant land. I've recently looked at the city-owned vacant land database, and it seems like about 10% of the land in Englewood is city-owned vacant land. So it seems like, in part, Neighbor Space has been following a strategy that's its mayor, the mayor of Chicago, has been advocating. I missed a clip, but there's this famous clip of Rahm Emanuel saying, it's a horrible thing to miss a crisis. A crisis is a horrible thing to waste. It allows you to think about new things you didn't think you could do before. And so Ben Helfand, at this great event that 596 Acres put on in New York earlier this year, said basically the same thing, that historically community garden groups have ridden on the coattails of whatever crisis is hot and gives them funding. Right now, that's urban ag. And urban ag is a hot thing responding to what people perceive as a crisis, lack of employment, too much vacant land, that allows him to get more vacant land in trust, which he knows may not eventually be used for urban farms. But right now, this is what it is starting to look like. There's this commercial wave. This is the first urban farm, nonprofit farm, that Neighbor Space has in trust in the Englewood neighborhood. It's now built out. It's got a couple of hoop houses. And the next step beyond this, I mean, this itself took Neighbor Space board getting together and thinking, can we do something beyond gardens? Is it possible for us to do nonprofit farms? And they said, okay, under our bylaws, we can do this. The next step, which it seems like they're about to get funded, is a process to think about when the city is unloading vacant lots for $1 in Englewood, is it possible to aggregate those in a way and have people do entrepreneurial for-profit farming, but have the land be held in trust so that the for-profit farms don't have to worry about that? And it seems like funders in Chicago are about to get behind a process to put together thinking about how that would work, whether it's Neighbor Space or some other trust holding for-profit land, farming land. They've also been riding the foreclosure wave. Red are the areas of Chicago and surrounding Cook County that have been hit hardest by foreclosures. South suburban Cook County has been hit especially hard, inner ring suburbs. And Neighbor Space is starting a planning process to think about feasibility of expanding outside of the city of Chicago to neighboring suburban communities. This is in part helped by this new land bank that Chicago has, which is figuring out how to get vacant lots and foreclosed properties redeveloped. And officially, the land bank thinks about urban agriculture as just an interim use. It's not something that is seen as a permanent use of land. But if you look, they have this sort of afterthought, or maybe that's not idea, that's part of their logo of leaves, you know? Maybe that suggests that built into their idea, there is some room for long-term urban agriculture. I don't want to suggest through the presentation that urban land trusts are the only sort of vehicle for commenting. In Chicago and other cities, people are using parkland, land held by churches and nonprofits. They're doing lease agreements and license agreements with city agencies, public authorities. Chicago, the Chicago Housing Authority is providing land for gardens and for farms. Surplus federal land, there's the farm that is now the commercial farm that I showed you the picture of initially got some surplus federal land that was right on Chicago's Navy Pier downtown that they were going to use for a farm for people who were coming out of homeless shelters to work on. And the city said, no, there's no way you can do that downtown. But there's a federal act that gave them sort of first dibs on the surplus federal property. And then there's privately owned land. And sometimes people just use land without any permission at all. But I think that the Urban Agriculture Land Trust is this way that people are thinking about how can we use this form of property as an alternative to just public ownership or relying on private owners, but in a way that's very much linked to the needs of cities and to private owners who want to develop in the private market and see the benefits of having some open space. As I look at neighbor space, it seems like it's partly a bottom-up process of people who are gardening and want to hold on to their land, but also partly a top-down, elite-driven, policy-driven process out of which this Urban Agriculture Land Trust came. And it's a way of decommodifying urban land in an interesting way that's different than just putting it in public ownership as we do with parks. But more and more it seems like the justification for decommodifying land in this way is in order to spur job creation, economic development, the labor market, which is seen as flagging in certain parts of cities. Whether or not this is going to continue to be viable, whether or not urban farms and this type of development can deliver on people's hopes for jobs, I think remains to be seen. There's definitely some people who are skeptical about that. Just in closing, as we think about whether urban land trusts are the next big thing, the winning solution, whatever we want to call it, I think part of my research, which thinks not just about what's going on in the past 10 years and 20 years, but how this compares to what's been going on historically, this is perhaps part of a very long process. In the 1600s, the diggers in England, the leader said, England's not a free people till the poor who have no land have a free allowance to dig and labor in the commons. In the early 1800s, during a time of economic hard times, there was this idea that maybe we could use wasteland, which was thought of as sort of a common resource, as a way to keep people off of the charity rolls, which we might now think of as a way to keep people off of dependence on the welfare state. So, in closing, I think that this is a very exciting area for me, for a lot of us in the room. It has a very long history. I haven't talked at all about the nuts and bolts of how to do it. I hope you forgive me that, but the next speakers will. Thanks.
Okay, so now we've got the background here and the history and some of the sort of nuances, I think. The next speaker, Miriam Avins, established our very own Baltimore Green Space as a land trust in Baltimore. And first I'm going to read Miriam's bio, and then I'm going to just put a little bug in your ear I want you to think about as she speaks. Miriam Avins is the founder and director of Baltimore Green Space, a land trust that protects community-managed open space in Baltimore City. This project grew out of her experience with community gardening in Baltimore. She is a 2007 Open Society Institute Community Fellow and was awarded the 2010 Eileen Hughes Award for Leadership in Land Conservation for her work with Baltimore City to establish a straightforward way to preserve community-managed open space. Miriam serves on Baltimore City's Commission on Sustainability, and I will add that she works really, really closely with the Office of Sustainability, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the real estate offices, and anybody else she has to get her job done. And here's the little nuance. This is for the lawyers, everyone who sees themselves even overlapping lawyer, student, farmer. All right, she's going to talk about sort of some of the nuances between a commercial farm and a community farm as part of this. And I want you to think about land trusts as a way to help commercial or not. How's that? As if this is a class or something.
Hi, everybody. Well, you already know, I'm Miriam Avins. Man, you just said everything I was going to say at the beginning. So I'm bringing you the case study portion of this. Baltimore Green Space, which was founded in 2007. We now protect 5 sites. We have another 5 in the pipeline. And I really liked how Nate defined a trust as we own it, you get the benefits, because I heard that before, and it really explains what we do. The people we work with use the land, love the land, maintain the land. They don't want to receive the $900 water bill that I got and was able to kind of neutralize. They don't want to see those 44 property tax bills jammed in the mail slot. I think of us as sort of the white-collar solution for the headaches that come up in people's wonderful volunteer work. And as a community gardener myself, I can tell you these are things I don't want to deal with. When I'm in the garden, I can barely put a sentence together. And that's the way I like it. So I want to just start with a few maps that show the situation with land in Baltimore, because it's really important background. We reached our peak population in around 1950. We had almost 1 million residents. And since then, for lots of reasons, people have been leaving the city, not so much anymore, but in the end, in 2010, we had 621,000 people. As somebody at Housing and Community Development likes to say, people moved to the county and they forgot to take their house. So we have an awful lot of vacant houses, we have an awful lot of vacant land. We've lost 1/3 of our population. This is what it looks like. The red dots are vacant houses. They were printed on top of the blue dots, which are vacant land. So there's actually a lot of vacant land where you're seeing the red dots. And you can see how it's concentrated in certain places. Now, this is a map of our food deserts. And you'll notice, I hope, that they actually look remarkably similar. So what you're looking at is areas of major disinvestment. This nicer map, oh, I've lost so much detail. Anyway, this is a map of the community managed open spaces that Baltimore Green Space knows of. I want to emphasize this is all on land that can be bought and sold, so it's not all the school gardens and things in parks and stuff like that. You'll notice again, it's really focused in that central areas where the most projects are, and going up Greenmount Avenue and somewhat in Park Heights. And you can look at this several ways. You can say, well, of course that's where all the gardens are, that's where all the land is. That's one way to look at it. The way I see it is that people will take whatever resources are at hand to bootstrap their neighborhoods. They don't want to live in areas of disinvestment. They will invest on the ground through their own sweat equity. So what are they doing? Often they do vegetable gardens. This is the Duncan Street Miracle Garden. It's a half-acre garden that we protected in 2010. It is the entire 1800 block of Duncan Street. This is the first site we protected. It's the Upper Fells Point Improvement Association Community Garden. And this is actually the only unpaved surface in the neighborhood. But it's not always with an emphasis on food. This is the Pigtown Horseshoe Pit, which we protected in 2010. And Brentwood Commons, protected just last year in 2013, provides a nice sitting area, and it's actually real prettier now. I need a new picture. And these are houses that face North Avenue and Greenmount Avenue's over here. It's like really hyper-urban except for the vacant land, but most of the vacant land is not prettied up. So it makes an enormous difference. And here's some just beauty shots of a garden we don't have the privilege of preserving yet. This is our community garden in Sandtown, Winchester. This is a central block area. They don't tolerate vacant lots in this neighborhood. If a house comes down, even right in the middle of other houses, they get it planted fast. When I go visit there, I'm often disoriented because there's new gardens. This is a garden that's planted on a corner where there had been a number of shootings. It's called the Memory Garden, and it succeeded in pushing out the violence from that corner. So it's really, I just want to emphasize that what we do is, the emphasis is not just agricultural. Here's the heroes who do that garden. I just want to talk a bit about the model that we follow. We are very much a bottom-up community land trust. We were founded by 4 community gardeners, including myself. Since then, our board has really expanded, and we've had a real emphasis on getting the professional skills we need, the connections we need. As we're looking around ourselves now, we're like re-emphasizing trying to look more like the city we serve. And it's really a bootstrapping operation trying to build a board this way, and it's been really tremendously interesting, challenging, and very rewarding. I have to say, I love my board. One of the first things we did is we went to Chicago and we learned about their model. One important thing, at least about their model at the time, is Chicago Neighborspace protects established sites. So they're not looking to start gardens, but that's kind of changing. Ben, the director there, is onto a whole new world, and we're a lot newer than they are. We're not there yet. But some other key pieces are they had government funding. They had from 3 different levels, each level giving them $100,000 per year. I said, I want that. Yeah, it didn't happen. And the other thing they had is they had this deal with Chicago, where Chicago would sell them land for $1 per lot. And that was the other thing I said, I gotta have that. I don't, basically trying to preserve land at the time we started, from the point of view of the gardeners, it was a capricious process. You had no idea what was going to happen. You had no idea what was going to be asked of you. And from the city's point of view, it was kind of disorganized because they didn't really have a clear-cut policy. And I'm going to get back to that later. As I already told you, we have currently 5 sites protected. We've moved kind of slowly on that because we've been very self-conscious about trying to do it right. And we've also been really focused on advocacy. We do have another 5 in the pipeline, so we're picking up speed, I'm glad to say. So the advocacy very quickly became an important thing because we had to convince Baltimore City to act like Chicago to the best that we could. And I have to say, it went really, really well. And it gave us kind of a taste that what we needed to be was the voice for what I call not so vacant land. So here in Baltimore, land is either developed or it is vacant. So you can have land with gardens on it, and from the city's point of view, the only way they can classify this is vacant. You can have land with forests, and the only classification they have for it is vacant. So Baltimore Green Space has come to see itself as the voice to speak up for those kinds of land uses that don't have a proper name in how the city talks. So let me tell you a bit about our advocacy. This is the city's own internal document on how to transfer land in community use to land trusts for $1 per lot. And this was my big project. Beth over here said, you're going to have a seat at the planning department, you're going to work from within, this is going to be great, and it was. It features 4 criteria. So there's criteria the city wants to see or satisfy, and there's a whole process laid out. And the criteria, real briefly, and they're the same criteria that we use internally. The request has to come from the neighborhood. So Baltimore Green Space can't come to the city and say, what a great garden, we want it. And the city can't say, what a lot of lousy land, give it to Baltimore Green Space. And the neighborhood has to say, we want this relationship. The second is that it's benefiting the neighborhood. So there's lots of ways, the food gardens, sitting gardens, but also we look at, is there an increase in wildlife? Is there an increase in livability? Things like that. We need to see that it's got the ability to last. So we're looking for a committed site manager, an assistant site manager, a community partner, some organization on the ground that can help in whatever way, and to see that the site is at least 5 years old. We want to make sure that they're not just in the excitement of startup and coming to us. We want to see that the excitement of the neighborhood's moved on to something else and the garden is still strong. And it also takes a while for a place to start to look like a place and not a project. And 5 years seems to be a reasonable time for that. Anyway, we shopped this around. We went to so many departments. We went to the mayor's office, the city council presidents, the comptrollers, and it was just, Beth was reminding me the other day of what a big deal it was to make this happen. Another piece, and this is just one little piece of the water project. I've been a broken record for years about the need to get gardens better water access. What's really funny about this advocacy push is we have nothing to show for it with our name on it, which is fine with me, but in fact when DPW was finally ready to really get real and figure out how meter pits could be used for water access, we were not allowed in the room. It's like they did not want to talk to civilians. So they didn't, and now the Office of Sustainability is actually funding another nonprofit to help with water installations that need to be more expensive. It's really great stuff. Then when the city was gearing up for vacants to value and was really wanting to sell more land, they asked us to tell them what lots were in community use. And that's kind of developed over time. It's become a little more selective how they want to look at that, which is reasonable. So that's something every 6 months we give them lists of lots that we feel really shouldn't be sold. And finally, our newest thing is forest patches. And this came up because a neighborhood called us. They were afraid they were going to lose a bunch of forested land in their neighborhood. A new resident bought 2 lots. They were afraid he was going to clear it. And he did. But it made us do some research, and we learned that 20% of the city's tree canopy is in forest patches outside parks, and those are the dark green areas. Got to talk about it because it's my latest push. I got a little off topic. Great places where people can really make a new sense of space and take what seemed like wasteland and turn it into community assets, and this time with like a really serious environmental thing. Okay, so that's what we do, and as you see, we really work with community-managed open spaces. So a question we wonder about, a question I hope you're thinking about, is does the model work for more intense farming? That comes in Baltimore in lots of different colors. This is White Rock Farm, which is just an amazing project in the Reservoir Hill neighborhood. And this was a project that was started by residents in the neighborhood who wanted to do something to address the fact that it is a food desert. And so they created this farm, and it's pretty intensive use of the land, but still everything looks handmade, everything looks loved. People walking by benefit from the beauty, and it has very much a community feel. They sell the food at a weekly farm stand, they sell it at a corner store. To make more money, they go sell it at the farmers markets. You can work for food, do a trade, and then it's actually barely fenced, so I think theft is another way the food gets into the neighborhood. They could fence it up more if that was really important to them. Really wonderful project. Another model of urban ag, this is Big City Farms. Now that is a for-profit benefits corporation, so human and social and environmental benefits is definitely part of how they think, and that informs their hiring, their benefits, their environmental practices, and all of that. It looks really different. You don't get to see the greenery, and so it's a very different model. So if these places were to come to us and ask us to preserve them, there's several things we have to think about. One is it a benefit to the community? I like to think that gardens are a benefit whether or not you are one of the people who do gardens there, because you walk by and it's pretty. I see this all the time with the garden next to my house. People slow down, walk slowly past the garden, and then pick up speed again. And so they're soaking in something. And also, is there tension with the neighborhood? Do you have trucks rolling in at 6 in the morning? Or has the neighborhood really adopted it as their own? So these are all things that we would look at. Then there's insurance issues. And Barbara over there and her crew are already working with us to sort out a lot of insurance and risk issues related to gardens, because for the first time we're getting sites that say, oh, we have a beehive, oh, we have chickens, and it made us scratch our heads and say, how do we do this? Especially since we were getting really conflicting messages from our insurance company about whether we could do this. But then you add sales of products. If you're going to use the food hub and bring your jarred things back, that invokes whole new levels of law and liability. Injury for paid workers versus volunteers. It's just a whole lot to think about. And if you're thinking in terms of urban ag and land trust, these are definitely things you want to think about from the start. And then the sustainability concerns are very different. So farms are just more intensive uses of land. So it starts looking, it just needs more labor on it. So if the main farmer, and it's a business, right? So the main farmer is supposed to move on to bigger and better things at some point. It's not like this labor of love where you expect these neighborhood people to be at it for years and years and sort of building up their hopefully building up the other people with them to take a leadership role eventually. So what happens when the farmer goes? We've been thinking about partnering with the Baltimore Farm Alliance, which knows a lot of people who want to farm, as a potential community partner if we do any of these projects. But it's just something definitely to think about. Like, you own the land, you own that land forever. That's serious. So how do you make sure the sustainability happens? And of course, that's a concern also with our community gardens. It's just, you got to think it through a different way. I think that's my last slide. Yep, that was, whoa. Oh, Kelly, how do you figure this out? Anyway, thank you for your time. And Kelly's going to go on with the nuts and bolts, which have given us hours of service and have really given us a firm foundation. Thank you.
All right, next up, the legal issues. This is where the rubber hits the road, I think. Kelly Pfeifer is supervising attorney at the Community Law Center in Baltimore. She joined CLC in 2005 as a staff attorney for the Pro Bono Project and Environmental Justice Project and became supervising attorney in 2007. In 2010, she took the helm of CLC's Equitable Development Focus Area. Kelly's career began as a land planner in the suburban Baltimore and Washington, D.C. areas. She holds a B.S. in landscape architecture from Purdue University and is a registered landscape architect in the state of Maryland. She received her J.D. and a certificate in environmental law from the University of Maryland School of Law in 2004 and was sworn into the Maryland Bar that same year. She's also a member of the District of Columbia Bar. Kelly's law practice has focused on equitable development and corporate and organizational issues for nonprofits. The goal of her work is to bring louder community voices to development projects in the Baltimore area. She has presented on panels at the American Bar Association's Equal Justice and the Reclaiming Vacant Properties National Conference. Welcome.
It doesn't need to go back to the title slide, as long as we can get it to move forward. Just so everyone is aware, I have some handouts of these slides, so you don't have to, like for the lawyers in the group who take detailed notes. I've got some handouts here that you can pick up on the way out. So we've heard some of the background on land trusts. We've heard our local Baltimore example, and now it's my job to sort of tell you, okay, how do we create a land trust, and what are the types of legal issues that a land trust will look at? At Community Law Center, we've been fortunate to work with Baltimore Green Space from almost day one. We actually, coincidentally, have our pro bono attorney who assisted them with their 501c3 application way back when, Mike Prettle back in the corner. It's sort of a treat to know that you're sitting in the room. And since then, I've worked a fair amount with Miriam, as have a couple of our other attorneys in our office. And so it's been a real a pleasure from a lawyer's perspective of watching a group start from the very beginning and succeed at this level. And you probably think it's been a long road, Miriam, but you've done a lot in a period of several years. And really, they've paved the road for other groups that might want to come along and do this type of work in Baltimore as well. So I'm going to briefly talk about these types of issues today. First of all, we're going to talk about forming a land trust, which is really, we're forming a nonprofit. We give a 2-hour workshop on that. I'm going to spend about 5 minutes on it today, so it'll be a real brief overview, but hopefully identify some of the things to be thinking about. We're then going to look at some of the types of policies a land trust might need to set up, and Miriam touched on a couple of those. And then some of the other things that we've worked through, she talked about developing the process to acquire properties from the city. And you also touched on insurance. The thing we're currently working on is property tax exemption, so that you don't have to pay property taxes on all the property they own. So we will touch on all of those things. Oh, good. So getting started, in forming a land trust, as Miriam mentioned, she got to this idea as a community gardener with some other gardeners. They thought, how do we make sure that we can have this garden always? You know, we don't want to know that it could be turned over to development tomorrow or next week or 5 years from now when we've put in a lot of time and effort. So gather your group of people who are interested in your cause. Often nonprofits, when they're starting, those are the people who are involved at the beginning, the people passionate about the cause. It can take time to bring in a more diverse board that brings certain skills, legal skills, accounting skills, networking, political connections, which can be so important. But gather that core group of people together. Figure out what your mission is. I've got here create a mission statement. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formalized mission statement, but distill what is it that you want to do. Pick a name. I often tell groups that it's important to choose a name that gives an idea of what you do. Baltimore Green Space, that gives you an idea that they have something to do with Baltimore and something to do with green space. So that's a great name. And your full name really spells it out. What is it, Baltimore
Land
Green
Trust for Community Management.
Yeah. So it's a mouthful, but it tells you what they do, which I think is just helpful in getting the word out, something that people can remember. You need some money to get started. This can be simple costs like filing to incorporate, filing for your tax exempt status, and so on. You just need to have a little bit of money available. And elect some interim leaders. You need to know who's can be out there speaking for you, making connections, and so on. The next step we suggest is that your organization draft bylaws. This is something that we actually require at Community Law Center, that every group that comes to us has a set of bylaws. If you don't, we will help you write your bylaws. But if you come to us with problem X, we do your bylaws first. The reason for that is that your bylaws are extremely important. They tell you how to operate your organization. They tell you who can be a member. They tell you who your board is, how they're composed, how many people, who your officers are, what types of responsibilities they have, how often you have meetings, and so on. It's basically the little constitution for your organization. And without having that in place, it's really hard to know that there's a valid organization there. You need to have these decision-making processes written out. We always suggest that you make them clear and easy to understand. Every once in a while, we have a client come to us that has a 25-page long set of bylaws full of legalese that we as lawyers are having a hard time figuring out. And that's just not going to work for your typical nonprofit starting off the ground. They don't need to be 25 pages long. They don't need to be too complicated. So make sure that they're clear and easy to understand. And I also always advise groups that the bylaws that you start with on day one do not need to be the same bylaws that you have next year, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. They should be looked at, they should be reviewed, they should be changed as needed. So don't feel like everything has to be set in stone from day one, even though today you may be a very different organization than you are 10 years from now. So just know that they are meant to be changed as needed. After you have your bylaws in place, the next step is to incorporate. When you incorporate, you're forming a separate entity that can conduct business in its own name. Here in Maryland, the process for that is filing a document called Articles of Incorporation. You also sometimes hear the word charter. You file that document with the state, and it's a pretty simple document. It's fairly standard, looks generally the same from one nonprofit to the next, with some touches here and there that might change. You have to be incorporated to become a tax-exempt entity, a 501c3 charitable organization. There are a couple of very limited exceptions for other business entities to obtain 501c3 status, but 99.9% of nonprofits are going to be incorporated. When you incorporate your organization, you're creating this standalone entity that makes there's something different out there that separates you as a group of people sitting around the table, bringing all of your assets and liability potential to the table. So if 5 people are working together on a project but they're not incorporated, if there are any problems down the road with liability, those 5 people and their personal assets could be at risk. If you incorporate, you get this general level of protection. That means that the corporation's assets are at risk. There are a couple of circumstances the lawyers can tell you about where board members of a nonprofit might be held liable for doing something particularly egregious and malicious. But in general, there is protection there, legal protection. Then the next step that nonprofits take, and land trusts take this step too, is to obtain tax exemption. So I'm talking about 501c3 charitable tax exemption that the IRS issues. The 501c3 designation is a section in the Internal Revenue Code. People often ask, what does that mean? 501c3, what a strange thing. Referring to a section of the tax code. And what it does is it designates you as a charitable organization. It means you can accept donations that are tax deductible, which often means people are going to be a little more generous. I might give you $100 if I know I can write it off my taxes. Otherwise, I might only give you 50. It also makes you eligible for grants, and that's so key for any nonprofit setting up the funding. I know Miriam talked about how jealous she was about the $300,000 a year, Neighbor Space has every year, and you're still working. You're working every day to bring the money in to fund your operations. So the 501c3 status is really important for that. There are a couple of restrictions. If you are a 501c3 organization, you cannot participate in any political activity. That means your organization cannot support or oppose candidates for office. You as individuals may do as you choose, but your organization may not do that. And you also have some restrictions on lobbying for legislative actions. You can do lobbying, it just has to be a small portion of what you're doing overall. To obtain your 501c3, there's actually a brand new process that the IRS just instituted in July. That for small nonprofits, if you are expecting less than $50,000 a year of revenue for your first 3 years, you can file this form 1023EZ. It's an online form, and it is a mere fraction of the time and effort and information that the full 1023 form causes or requires you to do. So we are actually at the Law Center just going through our first round. We've submitted a couple of those 1023 EZs and are waiting to see how fast they come back. That's sort of the big question overall. The full form, which we've all been doing for years, is a pretty lengthy form. It's about 20-some pages in length and requires a lot of documentation. It is a big project for nonprofits, especially groups that are just getting started out, because it requires you to really project into the future and think through what are you going to do, how much money are you going to raise. I think it's a really good exercise for nonprofits to go through. But it's nice that there's this newer option too for groups that think they're going to be pretty small starting out. We generally at the Law Center tell groups that the whole process from writing bylaws to incorporating to tax exemption can take 6 to 12 months for groups to go through, just as a general gauge. So now we've got your nonprofit structure in place. Here are a few things to think about once you're up and running as your land trust. First and foremost is how do you choose the sites that you're going to bring into your land trust? Miriam talked about some of the criteria they look at. The garden has to have been in use for, or the space has to have been in use for 5 years. It has to be a dedicated site manager and so on. So you have to think through that, because I know you're probably approached all the time by groups that want to be part of the land trust, right? Yeah, right, and it might be a group that we just started our garden this summer and nothing happens to it. Well, Baltimore Green Space has decided they need to be more established than that to make sure that the land trust can take them on. The reason for that is that the land trust is taking on the land. You don't want to be holding the land that you're not wanting to maintain. So you want to make sure that the group that's taking care of it is going to continue to take care of it. So you might want to develop an application process to get the information from the groups that want their land to be protected. You also have to figure out what sort of due diligence you're going to do. What is the environmental history of this land that people want to garden on and grow fruits and vegetables on? If it was used as a dry cleaning operation before, that might put up a red flag, because you might be worried about what's in the soil. So what sort of investigation are you going to do to make sure that the land you're thinking about acquiring is appropriate for the use that has been requested? And it may be that you say, okay, well, we can take, we might take that property on that we used to use as a dry cleaner, but we've got to do X remediation, and we're not going to let people grow vegetables on it. Something like that's just an example. So what types of things do you need to do to determine what sites to take on? Similarly, what types of requirements might you put in place on the groups that are managing the open spaces? Do you have rules that the properties need to be fenced off to keep passers-by from walking through? Do you want to limit their activities because there's some reason to say, okay, we shouldn't grow fruits and vegetables here? Are you going to allow them to build structures, whether it might be a small shed for storing tools or something larger? I'm not saying any of these are good or bad things, but what is it that you're going to require for the use of the property? What is it that you're going to require of the managers of the properties to report to you every year? Are you going to set up annual visits to see that they're maintaining their land properly? When you've got 5 spaces to visit, that might be a little easier of a task than when you've got 90 spaces to visit a year. So what is it that you need to know that is happening of all the groups that are using the land? Similarly, then you might want to write those requirements up into an agreement and have some sort of contract between the group that's managing the land and the land trust to make sure that everything is in writing and understood up front. You need to look at insurance issues, and I know that's something that you guys are looking at now with the law school clinic. What type of insurance do you need as a land trust? Who does the insurance cover? Does it cover the land trust employees? Does it cover the community volunteers that are working on the land, and so on? And then you might want to look at things like waivers for volunteers working on the site that might try to limit any liability of the land trust if something were to, somebody were to be injured or something like that. That's another type of thing that you might look at. Now, when we look at the property acquisition, there are a few different ways that land trusts can obtain property. One is by purchasing it. Most land trusts don't have a lot of money to be purchasing property, so that doesn't happen as often. One could be by donation, and it may be that somebody owns a vacant lot and doesn't know what to do with it, and they say, hey, I'll give it to this group. That, these community gardeners are managing the space, it's fantastic, I'll donate it to the land trust. And then you might acquire the property through the municipality. So Miriam described earlier that Baltimore Green Space led the effort to set up a process to obtain property from the city. And that was a huge undertaking in and of itself, just working through that and all the different agencies. But it's worked out very, very well to get those $1 transfers. This could be land that the city already owns, and it could also be a circumstance where the city can actually foreclose upon land that is titled to somebody else, but that person is long gone and probably has $30,000 of back taxes on it. So the city can obtain the title and then transfer it to the land trust. Just like any other type of property acquisition, if I buy a house or sell a house, something like that, you've got steps that you need to go through. So having someone to guide you through the real estate transfer is helpful. There'll be a contract on the property. You'll have to do things like title searches to make sure the title is free and clear. And then you'll have to do things like transfer the deed and record the deed. So there are some expenses along the way there too. We talked a little bit about how the municipality can transfer the lots, through their process. And we found here in Baltimore that the city wanted to include some restrictive language in the deed. I know in that first one is when we were, when the Upper Fells Point Garden is when we really worked through that issue because it was the first one.
Before the dollar lot.
Right, before we got the dollar lot process in place. but it really set up a restriction that says that this land must be used for community managed open space. The city, of course, is concerned that it could transfer this lot to a land trust for this wonderful purpose, and then the land trust stops using it for that purpose and wants to sell it to a developer. This Upper Fells Point lot, for example, is a pretty valuable piece of land. It could build a several $100,000 row house or two on it, three even. So, you know, they're concerned about that, so it restricted the use of the land. I think this is the last piece I'm going to talk about here, property tax exemption. So when you get that tax exemption with the 501c3 status, that's exempting your organization from paying income tax. You still have to pay property taxes, at least here in Maryland you do. I know there are a couple of states that exempt property tax for nonprofits, but we do not do that here in Maryland. So you need to figure out a process for how do we not have, you know, how do we avoid paying property taxes on this in a legal way? And what Baltimore Green Space has been doing so far has been sort of backdoor, you know, knowing somebody who works in the finance department or little details there. But, you know, people who are willing to change the value of the land to zero, which then of course generates $0 in taxes. That's not a sustainable process. If those people who are helping us now are no longer there, or, you know, rules change elsewhere, that's not sustainable. So last year, Baltimore Green Space advocated for legislature at the state level that would exempt community managed open space land trust organizations from property taxes. That was passed with the language simply giving the power to the cities and counties to make that exemption. So now we're working on getting that through the city process. And that's a work in progress right now. But this is one more consideration to think about when you take on these properties, that you may be required to pay taxes on them, and where does the money come from and how are we going to address that? I think that's it for me. Turn it over to Beth. You can handle some questions here.
So, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kelly. Thanks to everyone. So I think what I'm going to ask,
Okay.
I'm going to figure out how to turn the lights up.
I think it's
Oh, it's over here. Oh, just a switch. There we go. All right. So it's kind of not set up like a panel thing, so can I ask the three of you to just, do you mind standing? I've seen all these health studies now that say standing is extremely good.
It's just what I wanted to do.
So your blood pressure is going to go down and all kinds of good things. So we're going to stand here. It's a little bit more formal, but for questions. And I thought I wanted to start off with one piece that I think needs to be very clear to everyone in the audience, which is this sort of blurring of the line about what urban ag is. Okay, so from the purposes of the city of Baltimore, the way we've looked at it, because we watched it change and grow, is in the new zoning ordinance for Transform Baltimore. It's defined differently. There's commercial farming, and then there's community managed open space farming. And when you looked at the slides and you saw all these folks talking about these community spaces and the gardens and the farms, you sort of start at one end with a community garden that might be an incredibly large community garden, and it might grow a lot of vegetables, but they're given away. There's no actual sales. And then you move to something that's a little bit in the middle there, that White Lot Community Farm, where if you notice, there's no fence. There's the free movement of the citizens in and out of the property. They're invited onto the property to participate, but yet there is sales associated with it that then go back into funding that farm, but it's not necessarily for profit. Okay, they call themselves White Lot Community Farm. You have the word farm in there. It confuses everyone. And then you saw a big city. And I don't know, Miriam didn't point it out, but I couldn't miss a 6-foot chain link fence around that property. Did you see that? Okay, so when you start getting to the commercial farms, these people are growing food for money. Okay, even if they're a nonprofit commercial farm, they're growing food for money. Okay, And they have a business, or what I call a fiduciary relationship, with people who are contracted with them to purchase that, either through a CSA, it might be restaurants. So they're going to be less likely to want to interact with the community. Okay? So we define a commercial farm differently, also because of that, the commercial basis. They might have more trucks coming in and out, things like that. So in our future zoning code, they are looked at, they are a conditional use, they have to relate to the community, and the community talks to them about how they're going to do their farming. It still means they can exist. So my question to the panel then is, your land trust experts, either an expert or a land trust yourself, where would you draw the line? If somebody approached you, what are you interested in commercial farms? But I'm just asking everyone, and I'm going to start with Nate and then move down the line.
Since I don't run anything, I have the benefit of not having to decide. I just watch other people decide. But what I've noticed is that if you want, whoever you are, whether you're the city or an entrepreneur or somebody in the community, if you want there to be commercial farming, ultimately it seems like it needs to be subsidized. Whether it's a nonprofit and it's taking grants. I mean, the current model, it doesn't seem like anybody's got a winning for-profit, unsubsidized farming model, even for conventional agriculture. It's heavily subsidized. So if you can get low-cost, secure land, if you can get low-cost, skilled labor, I mean, whatever way you can get support for growing in this way, I think people will take it. And I think when it comes to for-profit farms, there's a question of whether, how much the city should be involved in getting low-cost land for that sort of enterprise and what sort of community benefits it provides. I mean, cities are constantly involved in getting low-cost land for all sorts of other commercial development. Maybe not held by a land trust, but maybe held by a trust. So I don't know how different that is, and it does seem like it's very, the lines are blurred.
I would say at this point in our development, we haven't hit the 10-year mark, we haven't hit the 10th site mark. It's a place like White Luck Farm, which is such a community creation. We would bend over backwards to figure out how to make that happen. At this point, they are looking at land security, and they're into autarky. They want to own themselves, and that may be what happens. I'm watching with great interest what Ben is doing in Chicago, and I would love to come back with the answer, yeah, we can do urban ag. We have this whole other model for how we do urban ag. We're not there yet. We're trying to digest the forests right now and how we can do that. So it's someplace that I think we're not ready to go, but boy, it'd be really cool if we had a piece in that.
And I would say from the legal perspective, you have to look at whether taking on these more agriculture and farm efforts would fit within your tax exemption purposes, your charitable purpose. So a nonprofit structure would likely fit in that more than a for-profit structure would. There could be ways to create a subsidiary that would handle the for-profit piece. There might be reasons to create a separate entity altogether to help, have like a different arm. So there would be things to think through.
I mean, maybe to add, in Englewood and Chicago, what people seem to be thinking towards is a nonprofit cooperative collective of for-profits, which is common in Berlin.
I see a hand up.
So, yeah, I have a couple burning questions. I'll probably have to catch Nate on the tour if you're going with it, because I have too many for you. But it's very interesting to hear the combination. Thank you so much. As an urban planner who works with nonprofits and a lot of legal things, so I answer a lot of your questions. Raise my hand. I'm very interested in that blurred distinction, and in my community where it's very difficult because the resources aren't the way they are here. The land is not valuable at all. In Baltimore, you can see rapid revitalization competing with probably urban farming. But I would say in our community, the distinction would be anything where there's a public need to repurpose the land. It can be considered something that's a community purpose. So even if it's a commercial venture, it's a community purpose. So I like your answer. But I was wondering, the question I had for you was, where you have the land trust, making rules about what the uses on the land are, where does that bump up against what the zoning rules are? So for example, fences or accessory structures, where can you decide if you want to regulate differently?
Well, certainly everything would have to comply with what the laws, the city laws require, housing, things like that.
But where can it be helpful or even, support? I guess that's the question, what is the overlap there in the relationship between maybe setting the terms for zoning in a community that doesn't understand? I guess in Baltimore, you understand it pretty well.
We're trying.
You work closely with the planning office, I suppose?
I'm in the planning office.
Right.
Interestingly, the Office of Sustainability sits in the planning office, and we helped write the code, the new zoning code that's up. And I would say that, yeah, what that means is we would call Miriam and go, Miriam, what should we do with this? So, basically, you're right. We have now, with Miriam's assistance and several others in the community, we drafted there's an actual use in the code called community managed open space, okay? And it answers all your questions. And if you just, I think it's Google Transform Baltimore, or trying to remember what the other, it was Rewrite Baltimore, I think, it'll pop up, and you can just find the definition in there. But it allows for accessory structures. It has the setbacks. It talks about the uses so that they exist legally right now, because they don't even know what that is in the code. Our code was written in 1971, so it doesn't know what a computer is either, or skateboard. But it's really hard to deal with. But the new code will then give much more guidance to the community as to what they can do. So lucky for us in Baltimore, our zoning people, they understand what we're doing, and we come to them with these bizarre problems. Like, we have a farm. There's no way you can put a farm on this site. How are we going to do it? And they'll figure out a way. They'll be like, well, we're going to define this as a temporary use. Okay? Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Some of the other things that we have, we took a lot of our documents to begin with from Chicago, and then we rewrote them for the Baltimore context, we thought, and we keep learning more. In our agreement about what you can do on your site, a lot of stuff was put in there for insurance concerns, and as we learn more and more, we're finding that, well, actually, you could have a pond on your site, or whatever it is. But a lot of the things came in there due to insurance concerns. And that's where you might get more restrictive. I have to say, for me, one of sort of the heartbreaking things is you think you're starting this organization to do something for people, and then you find as you go that the organization itself has needs and a point of view, and that you need to take that seriously. And that's, I think, like, if you can't tell already, Kelly's been my lawyer from the beginning. And that's something that Kelly has really helped me come to terms with over time. So that's part of some of where it comes.
So one of the things that we run up against is we have the same issue of the city looking at a community garden as vacant space, and that it's a potential real estate development that is a lost real estate development if it's allowed to remain as a community garden. So I'm wondering if you guys run into the same problems with the real estate department of the city, and how you are kind of pitching this to get them on your side.
Yeah. So one of the first things that I learned, and one of the things you all should understand, is when you think about city government, people talk about, oh, government this, government that. There is no unitary city government. City government is composed of different agencies, and these agencies all have their own priorities. And if you think about it, it's kind of like democracy is made of all of us kind of hitting against each other with their own points of view. So is city government. And people can only do what their job descriptions are. So it's been really interesting. Beth over here got it from the first. Surprise, surprise.
It's my job to support you guys. That's my mission. Okay.
The real estate
But
office.
we're lucky to have a Beth.
Oh my
And a
goodness.
sustainability office, because
Not everyone
all
does.
cities have that.
Yes.
Right? She can get us to the right people, and
And then I'll set it up the meeting with that person
Yeah.
And so that there's an internal advocate. So I think the thing here is like, look at the mission of the Department of Finance. They want your tax dollars. They've got to have your property taxes, right? And that's all they think about, and that's all day long, 24 hours a day. Any loss to that gives them heartburn. The Department of Housing and Community Development, which we work with a lot and we're friends with, what's their mission? Dispose of land for development. Okay, there's nothing in their mission statement that says save land for open space. It's not there, okay? So it's really, we sort of work inside game, outside game. I can talk to them. That's why when we did this project, I said, Miriam, you're coming in. I'm gonna give you a Baltimore city government email address and an ID that says I work for the planning department. It removed a million walls. They didn't automatically look at her like she was an enemy, you know, or some strange outsider. So I think answering your question is, I was going to ask that question, you know. It's kind of like we had to change our message working with each of those different agencies to help make them less uncomfortable.
In particular with the Department of Finance and Real Estate, what was the message? What are some of the talking points that worked for you guys?
Well, this was the best thing. So the real estate office is under the comptroller's office.
Okay.
Beth and I went to go visit the comptroller, brought my pictures. I was really nervous about this. Well, guess who's a gardener? She is, and she got the health benefits and the this and the that. Like, we talked up that part. And the other thing you need to understand is people who work in government tend to suffer a little from sensory deprivation. You know, you're looking at a lot of paper. You take around your pictures. Never go anywhere. If you're talking about gardens, or farms, you're the most lucky person in the world because it's pretty, okay? Take your pictures. What you're trying to do, and we haven't done this in finance, okay, everywhere else, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to talk to people's job descriptions. So when we go to HCD, we talk about rising property values and stuff like that, or anyway, but you're also trying to connect with the person. And you do that through the beauty and whatever it is. And if you are able to do both of those things, then you've become the happy little project that they work on. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, I'm just all the more grateful that we have
And
on our side.
finance, we're still working on.
Yes.
This property tax exemption.
But let me tell you how we're doing that, okay? Just so now you have another thing to go back. One is we're trying to use rational thought, okay? So I like to use data, right? So to get them outside of the heartburn or the anxiety of, oh my God, I'm watching what they do is they're looking at a bunch of numbers and they're going, if I start pulling properties out of this tax feeding in, I'm gonna have that much less money to spend and the city will go bankrupt, right? So, okay, generically, let's think about this. Let's be serious here, okay? How many sites are we really talking about? She has 5, okay? She's gonna have 10. We might be talking about 25 sites, 35.
We may be talking about 1% of the vacant land in
All right.
Baltimore City in 10 years.
And then you calculate that out, and it's pennies on the dollar, okay? So it's sort of trying to help alleviate their anxiety with facts about what we're really talking about, you know? So that's another approach, and we're still working on that one. You know, the finance people are not happy with me right now, because we also introduced, we just introduced an urban ag for commercial farms tax credit. So, you know, we're gonna have both. They don't know this one's coming yet, but it will. But you know, I mean, this is how you support these groups. Oh, not you. You work for me. Oh, you both work for me.
I know. Wait. I have a question.
Okay.
This question is specifically for Nate. I was wondering if you had come across any studies that really looked at the economic benefit of having green space and that being a revitalizing factor to a neighborhood. We have anecdotal stories, specifically about White Lock Community Farm, the apartment building across the street from that. Once they rehabbed that and the farm kind of grew up and became such an asset, people wanted to live in that building, and he thought, hey, maybe I should look at another lot in this neighborhood and build a house. So I was just wondering if there are like concrete studies out there that kind of can speak to
So
the
there's-
economic benefit.
In terms of land values, there's a study that Voichu and Bean, I don't know how you
Yeah.
pronounce, but that's the only one that I know of that does VOICU and Bean.
You can find a link on Baltimore Green Space's website.
Are
But
there
that's
any
what I-
others? Is
Well,
that-
the Trust for Public Land publishes a lot of that.
Okay.
But aren't they specific to parks?
So it's mostly parks, but they have a few.
Yeah, I think the Voichu and Bean is
trails
actually
and-
community gardens.
And also, yeah, there's a few urban land trusts out there that publish them.
I don't, yeah. So I don't know when you start getting into the aesthetics of whether a bunch of hoop houses raise neighboring property values. No one's done that study, and I'm not sure.
Is there
People want to
any,
make that argument, would do that study.
We in Pittsburgh did one about community gardens, and we found that it increased to 20% the adjacent properties
Yeah.
surrounding a community food
I
garden.
need that.
Yeah, we
Please
need
talk
more
to
of
me.
that, yeah.
Okay.
That's how the other way to work with finance.
It's slippery though, because we're also trying to not push the gentrifying aspects of these community food projects.
Yes, that's, you look through certain neighborhoods in Baltimore and you're like, obviously property values need to go up. In other words, it'd be nice if somebody wanted to live here. But, yeah, and I thought our breakfast speaker's comments on strengthening institutions, I thought that was really interesting.
This is where the community land trust housing model paired makes a lot of sense. I mean, this project in Madison is 30 acres, and it's sort of crazy that they could do it all at once. But they've got community land trust housing next to an enormous community garden, next to a community farm, next to a prairie, which is a land trust held prairie. So when the property values rise, at least, the community land trust model should moderate the rise in housing prices of those properties. Maybe across the street that are not community land trust held will gentrify and go crazy, but.
One other way to support what you're doing with government entities is the health angle. There's lots of studies that show that community open spaces actually do increase public health, and that's a big deal. It's kind of the next big thing.
Look on the resources page. We have a lot of links to studies.
I do have one question. So if your neighborhood doesn't have any open space, but they're interested, I have a high elderly population in my neighborhood, and they would love the garden, but 2 neighborhoods away is the first space that I found that I could possibly get from the city. So when you get your neighborhood, do I have to go to that other neighborhood to get buy-in? Or can I use the resources from my own neighborhood to try to, because we can literally walk to the adjacent neighborhood, but do I need to get a buy-in from that neighborhood?
Depends on where you are. You know this better than I do. I'm just gonna answer from the government perspective.
I'm in Ashburton.
Okay.
Okay.
So from the Baltimore City Adopt-A-Lot, they don't care,
Okay.
okay? But Miriam's gonna tell you, you should care.
It would be wise, because you don't want the neighbor saying, what's going on here? Who are these people? We don't want them.
Well, it actually, you mentioned that one garden pushed out the crime. It's actually in a blighted little corner
You
that,
still, like, I know of a garden, it's a little isolated, it's next to a warehouse or a factory. Very few gardens have vandalism in the city, like, it's one of the really interesting things. This garden has had some really major vandalism stuff. You need to know your neighbors, whoever your neighbors turn out to be.
okay.
And talk to me later, I can point you towards some resources.
We have one last question.
I want to throw, I'm a Baltimorean in exile, and as Shelley knows, I was involved with the beginning of Miriam's project. But I live on the Eastern Shore, where I've been on for 6 years. I was on board on the Lower Shore Land Trust. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of land trust activity on the Eastern Shore. There are, to my knowledge, I think 4 or 5 different state programs to fund open space and that sort of thing. Now, mostly it's for smart growth purposes. I mean, the intent is different than the intent of these infill things. But my question is any of that funding available to, not at all?
Not really.
I mean, because there's a lot of money there, you know, I mean,
The first land trust conference I went to, I was like writing down all these things and trying to figure it out, and no, even like program open space, the land has to be owned by a municipality, which, you know, if Baltimore City wants to do that, that's really cool, but it doesn't help with me.
Well, but I mean, we've got, you know, millions of dollars of funding, you know, and we also use easements. I mean, most of the property is put under easements, and the landowner works the land. Some of them are farmers and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
And we
there's
monitor and
reasons
restrict their
That
activities.
doesn't really make sense in Baltimore.
I think it depends on what you're doing. I think I'm gonna, for your forest patch analysis,
Yeah.
that model.
Yes, and
It's
we're
perfect.
definitely more interested there.
But I think that actually requires us to go to the state. They need to modify how they define a land trust. I think part of the problem is the traditional definition at the state level, I'm glad you're here, is really preserving rural land
Right.
from suburban sprawl. But I think there's a really good argument to be made that some portion of those funds should be set aside to help make cities livable if we really want to.
Well, that's my thought. It's an
Yeah.
argument that should be made, and that there's
Yeah.
enough money there.
Come home this weekend.
Yeah, so you guys need to get together and then come talk to me. Yeah. Okay, we're at 10:33, so I think we got to sign off. Thank you all for coming.